At a mess hall in late May 1944, Wisconsin, the air was heavy with the scent of boiled potatoes and dust. The bell rang twice before sunrise, and the cooks moved with the rhythm of habit, trays clanging, ladles dipping, steam clouding the glass of narrow windows. Among them was Sergeant Harold Webb, a man in his mid-30s with sleeves always rolled to the elbow and a quiet precision in his movements. He wasn't known for speeches, just for the way he counted portions, as if they meant something. That morning, like every morning, he started the line with vegetables, peas, beans, carrots, all spooned neatly onto the plates, meant for German prisoners. It wasn't charity, and it wasn't a statement. It was simply the order he believed things should be done. Outside, the camp was still waking up. The POWs lined up in pairs, boots scraping gravel, guarded by soldiers who looked as tired as the men they watched. When the doors opened, the hum of the kitchen changed. The prisoners entered quietly, eyes lowered, but curious. Webb nodded once at each man who passed. He never spoke more than a few words, but they knew the routine: trays first, bread last, no waste. There was a comfort in it, an unspoken pattern that both sides learned to trust. The first few weeks, the other cooks thought his insistence was strange. "They're the enemy," one said. "Why serve them better than the regs require?" Webb didn't answer. He only wiped his hands on the towel at his belt and kept the line moving. The food was plain, but it was cooked evenly, measured carefully. The men noticed. They began to eat slower, shoulders easing a little. The guards noticed, too, there were fewer arguments over rations, fewer complaints. It was as if the act of serving properly, the right amount, the same way each time, became a quiet agreement that life inside those walls could still hold some order. By mid-June, the camp's rhythm had settled around that kitchen. Webb arrived before dawn to check supplies, count loaves, and test the stoves. He carried a small notebook, marking down how much butter was left or when the potatoes would run low. The notes weren't official, but the quartermaster started using them anyway, because they were always right. Each entry, written in neat block letters, was a record of something larger than food. It was control in a place built to confine. One day, a shipment arrived late. The guards grew restless, the prisoners hungrier. Webb adjusted the menu without fuss, thinner stew, more bread, and spent his break slicing onions until his eyes burned. That night, when the food reached the POWs' tables, it was still hot. No one thanked him aloud, but a few of the men straightened their plates before leaving. It was a small sign, barely visible, but he noticed. Over time, something else changed. The German prisoner assigned to kitchen duty, a quiet man named Ernst, began mirroring Webb's routines, checking temperatures, wiping the counters twice, lining up utensils. Webb never corrected him, never spoke of it, but one afternoon he left the ladle in Ernst's hand when the siren sounded for inspection. Ernst kept stirring, steady as if the war outside had paused for that one pot of soup. Later that summer, the commandant toured the camp kitchen. He commented on its cleanliness, on the absence of complaints, on how discipline seems to hold well here. Webb only nodded. He didn't say that discipline came not from rules, but from respect, served in ladlefuls and measured with patience. When evening fell, the last of the pots were washed, and Webb stood at the window behind the sink. Beyond the fence, the POWs walked in twos, quiet under the long Wisconsin light. The clatter of dinner had faded, leaving only the low hum of crickets. Webb looked down at his hands, cracked, reddened, but steady. Tomorrow would be the same: trays, vegetables, bread, order. The war outside shifted each day, but inside his kitchen he could keep one thing right. The next morning began like all the rest, fog low across the fields, the camp whistle slicing through it. Webb stepped into the mess hall before the lights came on, the faint smell of yeast and soap clinging to the air. He reached for the logbook first, checked the inventory, and sharpened his knife against the steel rod until it sang in rhythm. The sound carried faintly through the thin walls, echoing against the silence outside. It was the same every day, and yet that sameness had become its own kind of peace. The German kitchen helpers filed in under guard. Ernst, now trusted enough to walk without shackles, gave a short nod. Webb answered it with one of his own. They worked side by side, sleeves rolled up, hands moving automatically, one slicing cabbage, the other scrubbing trays. The guards barely watched any more. Whatever threat had once existed in that kitchen had dissolved into routine. At 7, Webb tasted the soup. It needed salt. He gestured for Ernst to fetch the tin, and the man hesitated before offering it with both hands, a small courtesy learned from observation. Webb took it without comment, stirred, and set the ladle down gently. When the first bell rang, he positioned himself behind the serving line. Steam rolled up from the pans as the prisoners entered, their boots damp from morning dew. Webb's motions were exact. Vegetables first, then stew, then bread. Always in that order. That morning, one of the younger guards, Private Larkin, muttered, "You treat them better than most places treat their own." Webb didn't answer. He only motioned for Larkin to keep the line steady. But inside, he felt something shift, a recognition that maybe what they were doing here wasn't just feeding men, but keeping a fragile dignity alive. The rules of war were distant things, but the rules of the kitchen were his to keep. By mid-morning, the camp quieted. Webb wiped down the counters, rinsed his towel, and watched through the window as the prisoners sat in the yard, some mending uniforms, others sketching with bits of charcoal on scrap paper. The hum of the camp generator mixed with birdsong, and for a moment the world outside the barbed wire seemed far away. In late June, rumors spread that a transport train carrying more POWs was due to arrive. The kitchen prepared for double rations. Webb reorganized every shelf, recalculated every pound of flour, and stayed past dark to make sure no meal would be short. Ernst worked beside him silently, sleeves damp, eyes focused. When they finished, Webb handed him the towel and said quietly, "Tomorrow's going to be long." It was the first full sentence he had spoken to him. Ernst only nodded, but there was a flicker of understanding, something beyond language. The next day, the new prisoners came through the gates, tired, sunburned, wary. The guards were on edge. Webb kept the kitchen steady. He knew chaos spread fastest where hunger started. By noon, trays clattered, voices rose, and still the food came out on time. Webb stood through the rush, unshaken, his movements measured. When the last tray slid down the line, the room fell silent except for the scraping of spoons. For a few minutes, the camp's noise faded into something close to calm. Later that night, Webb sat outside on a crate, smoking the last of his ration cigarettes. Ernst passed by with a stack of empty buckets. Their eyes met briefly in the half-light. Neither spoke. It was enough that they recognized in each other the exhaustion that comes from doing things properly when no one else seems to care. By July, the kitchen had taken on a rhythm that even the guards respected. Men rotated through duties, orders were followed without argument, and meals came like clockwork. When inspectors arrived from headquarters, they noted the orderliness, but didn't ask why. They didn't see the small gestures, the even ladle strokes, the folded towels, the way Webb made sure the first tray served each day went to the prisoners, not the Americans. It wasn't written anywhere, but it had become the rule of the room. One evening after roll call, a summer storm swept over the camp. Rain drummed against the roof, leaking through in places, hissing on the stoves. The prisoners gathered near the mess hall, waiting for clearance to return to barracks. Webb stood by the door, watching lightning flicker across the sky. For a moment he saw Ernst helping another man under a poncho, shielding him from the downpour. It was an ordinary act, but Webb felt something tighten in his chest. Maybe decency traveled like that, quietly, through repetition, through example, through small unspoken choices. By the time the storm passed, puddles shimmered under the lamps, and the camp smelled of wet earth and metal. Webb went back inside, turned off the burners, and placed his notebook on the counter. The next day's entry was already written in his head. Same as always: count, measure, serve. By early August, the fields around the Wisconsin camp glowed with corn and dust. The war felt far away, though everyone knew it wasn't. Trains still came through with letters and lists, with names added and crossed out. But inside the camp kitchen, life followed the pulse of the stovetops and the clang of metal trays. The soldiers rotated shifts, the prisoners rotated duties. The steam rose, the knives sang, and Harold Webb kept the rhythm steady. That morning began with a broken stove. The pilot light refused to catch, and the air smelled faintly of gas. Webb knelt, adjusted the line with a wrench, and tapped the side twice before the flame finally held. Ernst watched carefully, holding a box of matches, waiting for the nod to strike one. When it came, he did it with the same precision Webb used, quick, steady, cautious. The flame caught, blue, and clean. They both exhaled almost in sync. Afterward, Webb reached for his coffee and leaned against the counter, staring at the floor for a long time. He thought of the farm where he grew up in Ohio, the way his mother measured flour by feel, not by weight, and how his father said the real work of a man was in the things no one noticed. He had never thought those lessons would matter in a war camp. Yet here he was, measuring beans for men he had been told were enemies, holding on to the same quiet discipline that made him who he was. The camp doctor stopped by mid-morning, a clipboard tucked under his arm. He noted the weight of the prisoners, the cleanliness of the kitchen, the lowered number of fevers. "You're doing something right," he said casually. Webb just shrugged. The doctor smiled. "Whatever it is, keep doing it." And then he left. That night, Ernst lingered after cleanup. The others had gone back to their quarters, and the only sound was the drip of a faucet. He hesitated before pulling something from his pocket, a small tin, scuffed and dented. He placed it on the counter. Inside were 2 folded scraps of paper, sketches, drawn in pencil. One showed the inside of the kitchen, the stoves, the long table, the shadowed window where Webb usually stood. The other was of a field, open and empty, with a single tree near the horizon. Webb looked at them without speaking. Ernst pointed to the field, then to the window, and said softly, "Fry? Free." Webb looked back down, unsure how to respond. The word hung in the air, longer than the moment required. Finally he nodded, closed the tin, and slid it back. "Keep it," he said quietly. Ernst hesitated, then smiled faintly, and took it. When he left, Webb stood there for a while, the hum of the ceiling fan carrying through the quiet. As summer deepened, the camp changed in ways that didn't show on reports. Guards who had once barked orders now spoke in normal tones. Prisoners volunteered for work details without resistance. The mess hall, once a place of noise and tension, became almost calm. The food didn't get better, but the way it was served mattered more. Webb didn't think about it as kindness or reform. He thought of it as keeping the place honest. If a man deserved food, he deserved it properly. In late August, a transport came to move a group of POWs to another state. Among them was Ernst. The morning of the departure, Webb came in early to set up breakfast. The light was gray, the kitchen cool. When Ernst entered, he went straight to work without being told. They moved in silence, side by side, as they had for months. When the final bell rang, Ernst washed his hands, wiped the counter, and stood still for a long time. Webb looked at him, then at the tray stacked neatly in the corner. He reached for one, set it down, and filled it. Vegetables, stew, bread, exactly in that order. He slid the tray across. "For the road," he said. Ernst nodded once, took it, and gave a small salute. Not military, not formal, just a gesture of respect. When he left, the kitchen felt larger, emptier. Webb stood by the stove, hands on the counter, eyes on the door until it shut. Outside, the train whistle carried over the fields, long and low. That night, when Webb wrote in his notebook, he added a line he never usually did. "One less helping tomorrow." Then he closed it, placed it under the flour sack, and sat for a long while watching the light fade over the fence. The next days returned to their pattern: roll call, meal prep, clean up. The rhythm held, but something inside it had shifted. The men who came through the line now paused a little longer, their trays steadier. The guards noticed it too. Webb didn't need to say anything. The habit had already become the message. By early September, the leaves along the fence began to turn. Webb kept the kitchen steady through the season's change. The war would move on without him, but the camp, for a brief time, had learned another kind of order, one built not on command, but on quiet integrity, served 3 times a day. By the first frost of October 1944, the camp mess hall had settled into a rhythm so consistent that even the wind outside seemed to follow it. The mornings started darker now. The lights came on before dawn, casting long shadows over the pots and pans hanging on the far wall. Webb's breath misted in the cold air as he measured out coffee grounds, the tin clinking lightly against the edge of the pot. The heat from the stoves came slow, and so did the men, American guards rubbing their hands together, POWs stepping quietly across the floor, waiting for warmth to reach their bones. That morning, Webb noticed something small. On the counter near the bread rack lay a folded piece of paper smudged with flour. He unfolded it. A sketch of the kitchen window again, the same one Ernst had drawn, but this time there was light streaming through it, shaded lines, rough pencil strokes, and a small figure in the corner stirring a pot. No name. No message, just that image. Webb stared at it for a long time, then tucked it into his notebook. Outside, snow began to fall, soft and thin at first, then heavier. The guards called out roll, their voices muffled by the weather. The prisoners moved slower, boots leaving shallow prints in the slush. Inside, Webb's crew worked faster, knowing the cold sharpened hunger. He checked every pot himself, adjusted every burner, and kept the window slightly cracked to let the steam escape. Around noon, the kitchen door opened suddenly. Lieutenant Greer, the new officer in charge, stepped in. He was young, impatient, and disliked the informal order Webb had kept. "Sergeant," he said, "you've been running this place like a church. We need more efficiency, less sentiment." Webb straightened, wiping his hands on his apron. "Yes, sir," he said evenly. But Greer's eyes lingered on the prisoners serving food, on the quiet rhythm of the line. "I heard you let one of them, Ernst, help without supervision. That won't happen again." Webb didn't argue. He just nodded. The lieutenant left, boots echoing down the hall. For the rest of the day the kitchen moved in silence. Webb said little, but his face tightened when he stirred the stew. The next morning, when new kitchen helpers were assigned, none of them knew the routine. Trays jammed, portions were uneven, and tempers flared. Webb corrected each mistake calmly, but the flow was gone. The rhythm had been broken, replaced by something mechanical and brittle. That night, when the others left, he stayed behind. The stove ticked as it cooled. Webb took out his notebook and turned to the page with the sketch. He placed it under the light, staring at the pencil lines until they blurred. Then, carefully, he copied the drawing, each line deliberate, as though retracing something he didn't want to lose. When he was done, he closed the notebook and set it on the shelf above the sink. The next day brought a letter from the quartermaster's office, supply cuts, less flour, fewer vegetables, no coffee until December. Webb read it slowly, then folded it once and placed it under the salt tin. He adjusted the menus again, thinner soup, smaller portions, but made sure the servings stayed equal for everyone. When a private suggested cutting the prisoner's share first, Webb said quietly, "We eat the same here. That's the rule." No one argued after that. By Thanksgiving, the cold had settled deep into the camp. The sky was pale and unbroken, the trees bare. Webb arrived early, deciding to bake what little bread they had left. The ovens filled the mess hall with warmth and the faint smell of yeast. He worked without hurry, kneading the dough with steady hands, the way his mother once had. When the prisoners entered for lunch, a few looked up at the sound of knives tapping metal trays. The bread was fresh, still steaming. No one spoke. Webb watched as they broke pieces off slowly, passing them down the benches. Even the guards ate in silence. That night, as he swept the floor, Webb noticed one of the younger prisoners pause at the doorway. The man pointed toward the stoves, then to his chest, and gave a short nod before leaving. Webb stood alone for a moment, broom in hand, feeling the quiet settle over him. The war was still raging somewhere far beyond the fence, but here, in the rhythm of cooking and serving, something steady had survived. When he stepped outside, the snow had stopped. The sky was clear, the stars sharp against the cold. From the barracks, faint singing drifted through the air, soft, low, almost like a prayer. Webb walked toward his quarters, boots crunching over frozen ground. In his pocket, the folded sketch pressed lightly against his hand. By the time he reached the door, he knew what tomorrow would bring. Another early morning, another round of counting, another steady rhythm of trays and steam. But as he closed the door behind him, he allowed himself one quiet thought, that maybe through all the noise of war, decency didn't need to shout to be heard.